Hebrews 5, verse 6.
God has appointed Jesus to be our high priest, one who has been tempted, we are told in chapter 4, verse 15, in every point like as we are, yet without committing sin. And thereby he has been taken through his humanity just like we have to go through it, and he has become a high priest equipped to meet our need. We are told that in chapter 2, verse 17 as well, that he is a faithful high priest. Verse 18, who has suffered being tempted. We're told in chapter 4, verse 15, he is a high priest who has been tempted in all points like as we are. And again in chapter 5, verse 6 and 7, we are told similar words, that he is a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, who in the days of his flesh had offered up prayers and supplications with strong crying and tears unto him who was able to save him from death, and was heard in that he feared. Now, all these passages refer to Jesus as a man who had emptied himself of his privileges and prerogatives as God when he came to earth, became one like unto us, that he might be the captain of our salvation, that he might be our forerunner, as we are told in chapter 6, verse 20, a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, who is our forerunner, even Jesus. And we are told here too that when he came here to earth in the days of his flesh, he prayed with strong crying and tears. Now, what was the necessity for him to pray with strong crying and tears? We are told in verse 7 that he prayed to him who was able to save him from death. And we are told that he was heard. His prayers were heard, and he was saved from death. Now, the only death that Jesus was saved from was spiritual death, not physical death, for he went through physical death, and he came out triumphant. What was the death that he feared to fall into? It was the death which is the wages of sin. He who lives after the flesh shall die. And that law applied to Jesus as much as to any other man. For Jesus lived on earth as other men. And he so feared God, as we are told in this verse. He feared. He had a godly fear about him that gave him a dread of falling into sin. And so, as a man, he cried out for help, that God his Father would keep him in temptation from falling. We're told in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus went to pray, he called 3 of his disciples, and he told them in Matthew 26, verse 36 to 45, we're told that he called Peter, James, and John, and he told them to pray with him. In verse 38 he said, "My soul is exceeding sorrowful, even unto death. Tarry ye here and watch with me." And he went a little further and fell on his face and prayed. And there again he prayed with strong crying and tears. We're told in Luke's Gospel that that agony was so great that his sweat was like great drops of blood. And he came back and found the disciples sleeping. And he said to them in verse 41, "Watch and pray, that ye enter not into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Now, Jesus was telling his disciples that because the flesh is weak, they had to watch and pray, otherwise they would fall in the hour of temptation. And that law applied to him too, for he was a man too, like them. He had come as a man like them. And he said that this law that applies to you, he implied applies to himself too. That he had to watch and pray, and that is why he had to go and pray 3 times, we are told, in the Garden of Gethsemane, he went and prayed. We do not know all the agony that went through Jesus' soul at that time. But we know that because he watched and prayed, he never sinned. That applied not only to that hour in the Garden of Gethsemane, but right through his life. We are told in Hebrews 5:7, in the days of his flesh, he prayed with strong crying and tears. We read in Luke 6 and verse 12 that once he went into a mountain and prayed for the whole night. We read in Luke 5 verse 16 that he often withdrew into the wilderness and prayed. Now, as God, there was no necessity for him to pray. But as a man come in our flesh, there was a necessity for him to pray so that he would not fall. And he prayed with strong crying and tears unto him who was able to save him from death, and was heard, in that he feared, because of his godly fear. As a man, he walked on earth like all other men should walk, in the fear of God. And thereby he has given us an example as to how we are to walk. For we are told in 1 John chapter 2 and verse 6 that he who says he abides in him must walk even as Jesus walked. And so Jesus has given us an example, and that's why he's called our forerunner, Hebrews 6:20, one who has gone ahead of us, run the same race, and who looks back over his shoulder and says to us, follow me, walking the same road that I walk, or running the same race that I run. We're told in Hebrews 12 verse 1 and 2, let us run the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross. Jesus is our example as we run this race. And he has given us an example as to how we are to face temptation. We're told in Hebrews 4:15, he was tempted in all points like as we are. But we so often fail and fall. He never fell. What was the difference? The difference was here, that he so feared his Father, that he dreaded to commit sin, that he prayed with strong crying and tears that he might not sin, that he might not enter into spiritual death in any area, and thereby he was kept. God alone could keep him, and God alone can keep us. We cannot keep ourselves as human beings in the hour of temptation. It's God's power that can keep us. And that power can come to us only as we pray. If we do not pray, we do not have that power to be kept in the moment of temptation. And when Jesus was tempted in all points, like as we are, he too had to pray. And he was kept because he feared God so much that he dreaded to commit sin. And thereby we have an example for ourselves, dear friends. In the moment of temptation, if we fear God like Jesus did, if we fear God so much that we dread to commit sin in thought or word or deed or attitude or motive or in any area, then we shall find that the power of God keeps us. If we cry out to God for help, we looked at that passage in Hebrews 4:16 where we are told to come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may find grace to help us in time of need. And we saw that the time of our need is the time when we are tempted so strongly that we fear lest we may fall. And when we so fear God that we do not want to fall into any sin in any area of our life, we don't want spiritual death to touch us in any area, then we shall cry out for God's help to keep us from falling, to keep us from sinning, to keep us from the smell of spiritual death. And then we shall be kept. And this is what Jesus himself did in the days of his flesh. When he was here on earth as a man like us, he offered up prayers and supplications with strong crying and tears unto him who was able to save him from death. And he was heard. His prayer was answered. And he was kept. And the reason is he feared. And he is our example in this area.